So my poor grandmother, she lost a son. Um, I wonder if she lost her Kirkor, Dr. Jimmy Kirkor first. No, I think she lost the son first, then she lost her husband. Then she lost the son whom she'd had out of wedlock, who died. He took part in the war against the Bolsheviks in 1920, because the First World War theoretically ended in 1918, but the Poles still kept fighting the Bolsheviks. So he died then. And then the son she had with am I being recorded? Yeah. Józef Kedroń, he turned out to be not quite with it. I met him. I mean, you could talk to him, and he'd run errands and take the children to school and pick them up and whatever. He lived with the Grabski family, Maciej Grabski, my cousin. But he'd get strange sort of ideas in his head, and he'd get all excited and everything. So he wasn't totally okay. So poor grandmother, the only child she had left was my father, and then the Second World War comes and she loses him. So she stopped her memoirs. She lived through the Second World War. She was in Warsaw, and she wrote her memoirs. At one point, I think she lost them and had to write them again. And she was living somewhere in the center of Warsaw. And when the Warsaw Uprising, not the Jewish uprising was the Warsaw Ghetto was a year earlier, but the general uprising of the Poles who wanted to liberate their own country before Stalin's armies marched in. And Stalin, who supposedly our ally, was supposed to help with this uprising, and he just kept his army on the other side of the river, just waiting for the Germans to do as much damage as possible to the Poles and for as many Poles to die as possible. So that was horrendous. But the Poles wanted to liberate their own capital, and so grandmother was there, and in her memoir she describes how she hears the guns, the bombs getting closer and closer, and then she hears that this neighbor was killed and this friend was killed and so lost a son. And then this I suppose he was an underground worker, came with food for them, and he'd bring some potatoes one day, and then a day later some cabbage, and one day he was so happy he brought them some horse meat. My grandmother adored horses. She had her own horse when she was a young woman. She refused to eat it. She was hungry. She refused to eat it. So she describes all of this, and she has a little maid living with her, taking care of her, because by then she was in her 80s, I should think, by then. And she just stops her memoirs. The last page is when the uprising fails, and the Germans, Hitler is furious. He wants Warsaw just practically leveled to the ground. He was furious. How dare the Poles rise up against this master race? So he has orders to have as many buildings demolished, dynamited. That's how the Stare Miasto, the old town, got just demolished one by one. They were, dynamited. Thank goodness, though, Ajenki Palace, the fuse didn't go off or something, so it was saved. But the capital was like 95% destroyed. It was horrendous. So the last bit in her memoirs is when she describes how the Germans force all the people in Warsaw to leave. And some were sent to labor camps, some were sent to concentration camps, some somehow got away. And it's raining a bit, and she's ill, and she's taken out on a stretcher. And some man, seeing that she's getting wet, takes off his jacket and puts it on her. And that's the last bit. She doesn't, I think she was so sad, because she never saw my father again or us. And she used to write me letters. She used to write to me, and I'd write back. I wish I could have some of those. I wish somebody had kept those letters and given them to me later on. So I have some of her letters. And she must have died in like 53 or 54, I think. So that would be 5, 6, 7 years after the war ended, 7, 8 years after the war ended.
Where is she buried?
But I remember she's buried in the Powązki Cemetery in Warsaw, where the Grabski family have a big plot there. But some friends, some people in whose house, well, she didn't live in their house. They lived together in an apartment house, and they remember she was extremely generous. Whenever we were always sending packages of food, clothing, teas, coffees, sugars, because under communism, there lack of food. lack of all kinds of necessities. So we used to send these packages, and they remember that she always shared the chocolate she got with them, with this family. So when I went to Poland, this would have been in 70 something. I was there alone, 1970, I've forgotten what the date was. These people were extremely nice to me, and they took me to the cemetery, Powązki Cemetery, and showed me the graves, and showed me the cemetery where there are even some American graves, because Stalin wouldn't allow planes, Allied planes, to land anywhere to refuel on their way to help the uprising. Poland was expecting that they'd be, by parachute. There's a squirrel climbing up. Oh, cute little squirrel climbing up the tree. They expected, munitions and things, and they fell either into the wrong hands or they fell into the river. And the pilots sometimes crashed because they weren't. Darling Stalin, who's our great ally, with friends like that, you don't need enemies, wouldn't allow planes to refuel anywhere where the Russians already marched in. So there are graves there of some brave Canadian pilots, a few American pilots. I'm not sure, maybe there were some British, I can't remember if there were British pilots. So I've been to that grave. And a lot of Boy Scouts perished carrying messages during the uprising from one unit to another, or through the sewers. My aunt Ella Grabska-Jankowska, whom we lived with, we shared that house in Cranley Gardens with, she was a heroine. She received a high order for her work. She carried messages written on cigarette paper, very thin paper, braided into her hair. And she was just a young girl, so they were very, very brave children sending messages. Once the Germans did a horrible thing, knowing that children were used to convey messages. They somehow allowed a tank to be captured, and the tank was booby-trapped, but the Poles didn't know about this. So the Poles were all happy. Here they are, in a lovely part of Warsaw, and children swarming all over this tank, all happy that it's been taken away from the Germans, and suddenly it exploded. And there were pieces of arms and legs that people found later on the third floor of their homes, and all these kids were killed. And I met a man when I was in Poland. I went with a group of my friends, the Sumirskis and other friends. We went in a bus from Poland to the Ukraine, part of the Ukraine that used to be Polish. And when we were in Warsaw, an elderly man who was with us on the bus pointed out the place where his life was saved, because he was also one of the messengers. But he went into a house where they used to meet and get these messages, and he was very tired, so he went behind a wall, a brick wall somewhere in the basement, to sleep. And that tank blew up and killed his friends. All his friends were dead, and the people in the basement were dead, and he survived because he was behind this wall. And he was in tears. This was just 6 years ago that I was in that bus, on that bus trip. And he was crying as he told the story, yeah. And I'm going in October, the middle of October this year, 2014. I'm flying to London, and I'm meeting my cousin from the Grabski family, although she's your generation, the generation of my children, Marta, married Larry Doggett, so her name is Marta Doggett, and she and I will spend a week with her in London, and then looking at family photographs, because she thinks I'll recognize more people than she will. And we're going to fly to Poland, to Warsaw, and spend 4 or 5 weeks in Poland, going mainly to parts that we haven't been to before, because I always went to Gdańsk, Warsaw, and Kraków, Gdańsk, Warsaw, Kraków, all these years. And Zakopane, of course, in the mountains. But I don't know a lot of the eastern part. I don't know the part that's close to Belarus, which also was part of Poland originally. So I want to go up there, and I want to see the Puszcza Białowieża, which is a big, we call it a jungle, but it's a big forest. It's the only part of Europe that still has wild bison, the original wild bison that the Tsars used to hunt. They used to come to Poland to hunt, and the bison are still there. So I want to go there. That will be with Marta, and she'll rent a car, yeah, because I've never driven in Poland, so I'll be a bit. Well, my Swiss school experience was from 1953 to 55 in Lausanne, and I arrived in England, back in England, at the age of 17. So I was really a year younger than most universities accept students. And 2 colleges accepted me, one in Oxford, one in Cambridge, but they could sense that intellectually I was okay, but they sensed that I needed to mature a bit, and they wanted me to go to an English school for a year, and they'd hold a place for me. And for me, at that age, a year seemed like forever. So I went to the university that accepted me, which was London University. My mother, of course, was happy because we lived in North London, and she could walk across Hampstead Heath for an hour, which she did later on with lovely Polish food. And she'd go to my university, which was London University, Westfield College in Hampstead, Kidderpore Avenue, Hampstead. It no longer exists. It merged with Queen Anne College, and later on your brother Andy went there. Okay, so in 1955 I entered university, and at first I was a day student, and then I got a room, my own private room, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. I studied French and Spanish, but to my surprise I had to do another year of Latin, because apparently you had to have an advanced level of Latin, and I had the lower level, the Oxford and Cambridge examinations, the lower level, and I didn't have the advanced level. So I had to take 3 subjects. I had to take French, Spanish, and Latin. That was okay. I made several good friends. Jackie Laveau, who was half French, who is still my friend. Jackie Laveau, Catherine Forrest, all English. Her father was a doctor up in the Midlands. And the third friend was Chuchu, Churatsi Vajrabai, who was from Thailand. And we used to sort of cook our specialties and invite friends over, and she always cooked delicious rice, and Jackie always made lovely French food and nice things. I can't remember what I made. Oh, I didn't make anything because my mother would come with jajka faszerowane, stuffed eggs, and all kinds of nice Polish goodies, because the food there was execrable. I mean, it was fit for the dogs. It was awful. English institutional food was horrendous. It was horrendous at my school in Channing School, where I met my friend Celia, and then it was horrendous at Manor House School, and it was horrendous at university. All the goodness was cooked out of it and thrown down the drain. Let's see. So I had 3 years of university, and I'd go to these hops, because we were all women in this college, 300 women, and the nearest male college was a seminary. And the greatest thrill was when the seminarian students would come and take our mascot away from us. And I can't even remember what the mascot was. So that was excitement. That was our excitement. So instead we went to hops, which were these informal dances organized by University College, other colleges, Bedford College, my brother's, which was the Imperial College. So we'd go into the center of town and go to these hops. And funny enough, some of these students would have like a stethoscope hanging out of their pockets, because they discovered that women liked medical students. So they pretended they were studying to be doctors and had a stethoscope hanging out of their pockets. All right, so after 3 years, I graduated with, I think I had second-class honors. And again, my father wanted me to pursue more studies at Oxford or Cambridge, postgraduate studies, but I wasn't particularly interested. I wasn't interested. So I took a job. Let me see, what was my first job? Oh, my first job was just a few months at Asprey's, extremely elegant store on Bond Street, which is the prime retail street, very famous retail street in London. And Asprey's was this very elegant store where all the men wore morning coats and striped trousers, morning coats, and we all had to be dressed in dark clothes and high heels. And it was the Christmas period, so we sold very elegant things made out of leather and silver frames, and wallets made out of crocodile, and bags and briefcases. And we were told if Alec Guinness comes in, the actor, that we're not to approach him. He doesn't want to be asked, sir, may I help you? He doesn't like that. And if any royalty come in, usually they sent their ladies in waiting. So the lady in waiting to Mrs. Let's see, Edward VIII's American wife, Wallis Simpson, the Duchess of Windsor by then. If the Duchess of Windsor's lady in waiting comes in, we can ask her if she needs help. So she would choose things for the Duchess of Windsor and take them to the Duchess's home, and the Duchess would choose what she wanted. So we were given instructions how to treat different people. And I remember once somebody came in, it was just before Christmas, and he said, "Oh, can you help me? Can you help me choose something for this man? He's got everything in the world. I don't know what to choose for him. He's got yachts. He's got everything. What shall I buy him?" I said, "Well, we have these beautiful wastebaskets out of tooled leather from Florence. If he's got so much, he's got money to throw away. Why don't you give him this nice leather wastebasket?" One American lady wanted to tip me. She wanted to make sure that I got a commission. And I said, "Oh, but I don't get commission. It's very sweet of you, but I don't work on commission." Another interesting moment was, I remember the name of the man who was the head of our department, Mr. Bromhead, I think his name was. Again, very tall, elegant in his morning coat. And he said, "Gather around, girls. I want to show you these photographs of one of our clients. This is their party in Bermuda, and they had this luxurious party, and they had sculptures that represented swans, and they were full of caviar, and look, and there's a swimming pool." And suddenly dawned on me, oh my gosh, I was at that party, because my great friends from my school in Switzerland, the Duncan sisters, Maruha and Rosa Duncan, Maruha was my roommate for 2 years, they invited me to Bermuda for one vacation, and I was there, and the Duncans took me to this party. They were very wealthy, so they had wealthy friends. So it suddenly dawned on me, oh my gosh, he's showing us these photographs of this exquisite party with the swan and the caviar. But I didn't say a word. I didn't say anything. I didn't let on. Let's see, another thing that happened there. My mother was very disappointed because one of the Asprey family, it was a family-run business, and one of the Aspreys, who was in charge of the jewelry factory or some jewelry department, invited me out for a date. And I didn't want to go with him. I didn't find him attractive. The guy I found attractive worked in the jewelry department, I think mending jewelry or making it or mending it, and I went out with him. My mother was very disappointed that I chose the lower caste. Let's see, what other memories do I have? Once they asked me to stand at the front door and when a client asked for a department, they didn't really give me enough instructions. So when this lady came in and said she wanted the jewelry department, instead of walking ahead of her, I kind of motioned her to walk ahead of me, which was silly. I'm supposed to be leading. So they never asked me to do that again. And that was kind of embarrassing. So I worked there for 3 months, I think, but it ruined my feet because none of the monetary transactions could be carried out on the floor. It was too elegant. So we had to run up and down the stairs in high heels, and I'd never worn high heels every day until then. Up and down the stairs, all the monetary transactions were in the basement, and then we'd run upstairs with the receipt or whatever. So that kind of ruined my feet. It was just a Christmas job, so just came to a natural end. And then I worked for the BBC, Bush House in the Strand, because it was the overseas. I worked for the the Overseas Talks and Features of the General Overseas Service of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the OTF of the GOS of the BBC. And the tune that everybody recognizes from my generation was da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-dum, da-dee-da-da-da, da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da. People all over the world, because Britain still had a lot of her colonies or ex-colonies, people always recognized that tune. That would be the BBC. And my boss was Muriel Howlett, very nice Australian lady, very tall Australian lady who came over to study voice, but then the war broke out, so she became a senior producer of our department. And it was a great job. I met all kinds of interesting people, politicians, rulers of different countries. I met Julius Nyerere, who'd just been elected the president of, was it Kenya? Julius Nyerere, Kenya, or was it Tanzania? It doesn't matter. Anyhow, he said, we're going to make Kenya a wonderful country, Julius Nyerere. And we did programs like sort of question and answer, or programs where people wrote in with questions that we had experts answer. So that lasted for 2 years. At that point, I had an American boyfriend, Bill Hoyerman, very nice guy. He had a Mercedes. He used to pick me up after work in his Mercedes and take me out for dinner or dancing or whatever. That was a very enjoyable job. I think I was there for 2 years. And then, I can't remember why I left, but then the next job was with the IAFF, the International Advertising film festival, the International Advertising Film Festival. So I worked on Albemarle Street, which was very close to, it was perpendicular, I think, to or parallel to Bond Street. Again, a very nice part of London. I used to drive in. My brother occasionally would drive me in his car to my job. So I was there for the Cannes Film Festival. And our film festival took place, it overlapped with the big film festival that takes place every year in Cannes, and then the alternate years in Venice, the big film festival, feature film festival. Ours always overlapped for about a month, and then it went on after the big film festival ended. So when we went to Cannes, I worked for Peter Taylor, the director, and when we went to Cannes, we were staying in a fancy hotel. I think it was the Majestic. I had a big room with 2 beds, my own bathroom, own balcony looking over the Mediterranean. And it was fun for me because my friend Marion Talbot was there. She's from the island of Jersey, but I met her through the Duncan sisters. And she was there working for the big film festival, choosing films for the Vancouver Film Festival. And so we'd go to films together, and she invariably fell asleep. And then she'd ask me at the end, she'd say, Lizzie, was that good enough for the Vancouver Film Festival? I'd say either yes or no. And then she'd take me to interviews with film actors. One was with Burt Lancaster, whom I had a crush on. Burt Lancaster had just finished the movie Il Ghepardo, The Leopard, with Claudia Cardinale. And so we had to go into a room where he was, and I didn't have any kind of identification that would allow me in, but the French are very, when they see pretty girls dressed nicely, they don't bother asking for their identification. So I just breezed by these guards and ended up in this room, which was full of people who officially were there to interview. I wasn't, but I had a little notebook. I pretended that I was an interviewer. And there was such a crush of women behind me that they pushed me, practically onto his lap. And I remember him giving me a look like this, interested look. But he had terrible complexion. He must have had acne or smallpox or something. He had a pitted complexion. But, it doesn't really take away, if it had been a woman, it would have been drastically unattractive, but he still was very sexy and attractive. So, okay, so we had his interview, and then we had an interview with Gregory Peck. And I think it was because he just made the movie To Kill a Mockingbird. And here we were in our summer clothes, all tanned with sleeveless dresses, whatever, and there he was in a 3-piece suit, dark blue, and looking very cool as a cucumber. So we had an interview with him and with Claudia Cardinale. Claudia Cardinale was with Burt Lancaster. Gregory Peck was with, I can't remember, maybe he was alone. And then Marion asked me if I would translate an interview she wanted to set up with our Polish, a famous film actor called Zbigniew Cybulski. He was like the Polish James Dean, very attractive, made movies in the 50s, 1950s, and he was there. And of course, Poland was deep under communism, unfortunately, so everything had to be, he couldn't set up an interview himself. He had to ask his trainer, the guy who was in charge of him, and he had to call Warsaw or call Moscow and ask for permission. So we thought we had an interview set up with him, and I was going to be the interpreter. And so we went to the Palais des Festivals, which was the headquarters of all these movies were shown, right on the Promenade des Anglais, parallel to the Mediterranean. And we waited, and we waited, and we waited, and we walked backwards and forwards in front of the Palais des Festivals, and he didn't turn up because he wasn't allowed to. The communists wouldn't allow him to be interviewed. Well, the police see us marching backwards and forwards, and they walk up to us and they say, "We're sure you're not, but this is what prostitutes do." They walk up in front of the Palais des Festivals, so, please don't. So by then we just gave up. So we never had the interview with Zbigniew Cybulski. Poor guy, he died, unfortunately, running for, sort of like James Dean, who died in a car accident, driving a car, didn't he? And Zbigniew Cybulski, who Marlene Dietrich was very fond of him and thought he was great. He was running for a train or a tram, and he jumped and he got caught under the wheels, and he was killed at a young age. Those whom the gods love die young. Anyhow, so that was my job there. And then, so after the job in June and July, I went back to England, and a few weeks later, I get a phone call from somebody called John Rogers, and he's a friend. Oh no, I knew he was coming, that was it. He was a very good friend of Patricia Syed, who was half Persian. And I met her at my school in Switzerland, Patricia Syed. And her brother had been my boyfriend for about a year. Very attractive guy called Bill Syed. Beautiful long lashes, dark eyes, dark hair. That was when I was finishing university. He was my boyfriend. So anyhow, so I get this letter from Patricia saying that her great friend John Rogers is arriving in London. Would I give him a good time? So apparently I did. I took him home. He liked my mother's cooking. Mummy made chicken for him. He liked my mother. He liked me. And he wanted me to go to the Scilly Isles with him because he had seen a movie about the Scilly Isles in Grand Central Station and was intrigued. So the Scilly Isles are off the westernmost coast, you know, Cornwall. It's very warm. It's sort of tropical there, and that's where all the flowers come from that London sold. And so, of course, being a goody-goody, I said, no, I can't go alone with you to the Scilly Isles. But we went out a few times. We went to some movies. I remember we saw Elizabeth Taylor movie, something to do with an airplane. Maggie Smith was in it. She played the secretary of the man who was married to Liz Taylor. I've forgotten the name of the movie, but I always remember we saw that. And at one point, we stood on one of those traffic islands somewhere off of Tottenham Court Road, and John Rogers kissed me, and a woman went by in a little car, and she looked out of her window and she said, "Be careful." A warning to this couple smooching. I don't know if she was worried we'd fall off the island or traffic island and get run over. I don't know. Anyhow, so John Rogers was there for a while, and then he left to go back to America. He was a lawyer, went to go back to his job, and wrote me a letter saying, would I come and visit him in America? And by now it's what? It's now November. So my father said he'd finance my trip, so I packed and went to America. And at first I lived with the Sulimirsky family, with Teresa and Witold. They were then in Port Washington, Long Island. I lived with them. And one day when I was coming back from a date with John Rogers in Manhattan, took the train out to Port Washington, and at one of the stops, an African-American runs through our compartment shouting, "The president's been shot, the president's been shot." I just thought he was a bit crazy. But then we pulled into a station, and I see cars with people around them listening to the car radio. This was before, cell phones and everything. People listening to the car radio. Kennedy had just been shot. So that was what, November 23rd. I arrived on November the 8th, I think, and John's birthday. Oh, it was funny, because John's, I'm jumping from one subject to another, but on the 10th was John Rogers' 30th birthday. And his mother had a party for him, invited all his friends, and they were all intrigued because they knew this woman had come from London, and they wanted to meet me and see me. And at one point during the party, John said, "I have an announcement to make." And I thought, oh my goodness, we're not engaged yet. What announcement could he possibly make? And it was his 30th birthday. He said, anybody under 30 goes into the kitchen and does the washing up. It's typical of him. He had a good sense of humor. And then there was a guy at the party, I only found out about this later, who had been Dad's friend at Yale. And apparently he was a bit of a sucker for tall stories. And John had told him a story about how he had met this woman in London who was half Ethiopian, and he invited her to come, and that her father was, I don't know, some lord in Ras something, Tafari or whatever in Ethiopia. So this guy, I remember him looking at me very, very questioningly. Very strangely, he was looking at me during this party. And later on, after we got married, he sent us a very nice leather box made out of leather for cigarettes. Neither of us smoked. But he broke off with Dad when he found out from Phil Sotel, a friend of Dad's, that the whole story about me being some Ethiopian princess was totally cockamamie, was total nonsense. And he was furious and broke off his friendship with Dad. Anyhow, so here we are. It's now, I think, January, so November, January, and John proposed to me in the kitchen of an apartment that he shared with two of his friends, and I accepted, and we were married June the 20th. 1964. My parents came over. My father was upset that we decided the children wouldn't be brought up Catholic, so my father was brought up Roman Catholic. He was upset about that. He nearly didn't come to the wedding, but Mum persuaded him, and I persuaded him. Also, my parents thought that my father asked me to go back to England before I made any major decision in my life. And I disobeyed him. I didn't go back to England. And John wrote to my father saying that I'd have trouble getting back into America if I left. Apparently that wasn't true, but anyhow. So we were married, and June, and we went for our honeymoon in Maine. His senior partner, Herbert Lord, who became a very good family friend, he and his wife Martha offered us their cottage, their summer cottage in Maine. So that's where we went. We rented a car, and we traveled around Maine, and we had our fill of lobsters. I don't think I'd ever eaten a lobster before. Maybe I had lobster bisque once. And beautiful weather. We swam in a quarry, and John even went horseback riding with me, although he was allergic to horses. His eyes became like tomatoes. We had a horseback ride, and then back to New York, and I had forgotten to mention, I had painted a little apartment that we took over from a friend of Dad's who was Greek, and he let us use his lease. We used up his lease at 1 West 67th Street, Hotel des Artistes. And at that point, the West Side wasn't fashionable. I mean, the building was super. It was a 1917 building built on a block where there were lots of apartments built specifically for artists with double-height ceilings. It was a very unusual block, West 67th Street, with some beautiful buildings, gorgeous apartments. And we took over this little apartment that had the living room downstairs with a tiny kitchen, because the kitchens originally were just reception areas for food that had been cooked on the second floor. It was sent via dumbwaiter up to the individual apartments. And each apartment owned a fridge on the second floor where they kept their food, and the chefs would make whatever the people ordered. So the kitchen was minuscule. It was tiny like this. And I remember the first time I saw a cockroach. I'd never seen a cockroach before in my life. And here was this cockroach walking across the ceiling. I was fascinated. So occasionally there were cockroach problems, but it was an old building. We had them in the basement too. So anyhow, we took over that apartment. And upstairs there was one bedroom, and then what I called a swollen corridor, which eventually was the nursery for John, my son John, and our son Roland, and a swollen corridor and a little bathroom, a small bathroom. So I painted it, and I remember chipping paint off the window in the bathroom, and a chip flew in my eye, and ever since then I've had an eye that gets bloodshot very easily. I don't know, something happened. This little chip went in my eye. The wedding reception. I had been in America as a child from the age of 4 to 8, but I don't remember it being particularly hot. Well, that June the 20th, there was a heat wave. And my mother-in-law recommended this room for we were married in the church, the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church, but the reception was somewhere along Fifth Avenue in the 72nd Street, somewhere along Fifth Avenue. I don't even remember where it was. And it was terribly hot, and there was no air conditioning. There were just fans. The poor photographer, I think after the first 10, 15 minutes of taking photographs, he just gave up. So I only have pictures of the first 10 minutes of the reception. My sister-in-law, Adrienne, who is married to Hartley Rogers, my husband's brother, she was pregnant with her third child. She had to go and lie down somewhere. Somebody else had to go and lie down. Luckily, I was sort of in a state of euphoria, so I didn't particularly notice the heat. In the reception line, there were lots of giggles. At some point, people were giggling away, and John looked at some little thing in his hand, a photograph or something. He was laughing away, because one of the guests my parents invited was Mrs. Ullman, who was the lady who was the hostess to my brother when my mother had that bad nervous breakdown, like in 1942 during the war. Mrs. Ullman took care of Andy, and she must have taken a picture of me and thought it would be funny to bring it to the wedding. So she gave my husband this tiny little picture that people were giggling at. It's me sitting on a toddy pot doing my business, and I'm naked. Somebody had thrown something over my shoulders. My bottom sticks out. I'm looking over my shoulder. And I was 4 years old, so so that was kind of amusing. We didn't have a big fancy reception, because at that point the rate of exchange between English pounds and American dollars was horrible, to my father's disfavor. I didn't want to charge him too much. So we had a short reception. We had champagne, but nobody drank the champagne because it was so hot. People drank the lemonade. There was lots of lemonade. We had some lots of little savories, and we had a nice wedding cake, and that was the end. And then I put on my beautiful, shocking. Oh, and the wedding dress again. I didn't want to charge my father too much, so I went to Bergdorf Goodman's. No, Bonwit Tellers. I went to Bonwit Tellers, and I bought one of their models. You know, before you order your wedding dress, you try on the model, and from that you order your wedding dress. But the model fit me perfectly. It was a beautiful dress with lots of lovely little lace things here. It was very pretty little pearls. And they just cleaned it for me. It wasn't even dirty, but they cleaned it. And I went to Bergdorf Goodman's and bought a veil. I think the veil cost me nearly more than the dress. And match shoes, satin shoes. So it was a very pretty dress, a very pretty outfit. I had my hair up with a coronet. And then my going away outfit was shocking pink, silk shantung, tight dress with a matching jacket. And Daddy had been nabbed by his friends. So he came out of the room where I think he must have changed into something, and he was all tousled, and he had a chain around his ankle attached to a huge green balloon with Elizabeth written in every language they could think of. Elżunia, Elżbieta, Isabel, Elizabeth, Elizabeth, Elizabeth. So we left the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church with these. We left the reception. It must have been the reception that we left. I always thought it was the church that we left. Now, of course, it would have been the reception, wouldn't it? Yeah, because at the reception I was in my wedding dress. So we had our honeymoon. We come back to New York. We live at the 1 West 67th Street. John becomes partner at a very young age. I think a year later he became partner, which was unusual. Usually people don't become partner that quickly. I think in the history of Burlingham, Underwood and Lord, Admiralty lawyers, they were like the Cadillac of Admiralty lawyers. You don't become partner until you're much older, so that was unusual. So he was very successful as a lawyer. He had some very interesting cases. He wrote articles for the Journal of Commerce. He always made them very funny and always had a funny title to them. And one was about shipping a giraffe, and the giraffe somehow broke loose in wherever the ship landed from Africa, maybe Brooklyn somewhere, and it made a dash for the only light it could see. And of course that led to the water. The poor giraffe fell into the water and didn't survive, because I think giraffes don't swim, even though they have a neck like a sort of a submarine periscope. And then another article he wrote was very funny. It was about a widow suing a shipping line because her husband had to relieve himself on this ship. It was a freighter, and the johns weren't working, the head. I can't remember if ships call it the head or the john, but anyhow, it wasn't working. So he had to sit on the railing of the ship and relieve himself. And the weather wasn't that good, and a big wave came and took him down off the railing, and he drowned. So the widow was suing the shipping line, but it was a serious case. But John always knew how to make it sound funny. So what else can I say about our married life? We traveled quite a bit. We went to Belgium at one point, where my French came in useful because the clients were French, I think, and they didn't want to admit that they spoke English. They wanted everything done in French, so I had to interpret backwards and forwards, so that was kind of fun. We went on a trip to the Caribbean, but very soon after I got married, I got pregnant. I was hoping to wait a bit, but Dad wanted children right away, and I was hoping to have at least a year of married life, just as a young happy-go-lucky couple. So we were married in June of '64, and John, my first son, was born in August of the following year, '65. And then Roland followed 2 years later in '67, and then Andy 5 years after that in 1972. But I'm going a bit ahead of myself. Okay, so with John, he had that little room, the swollen corridor leading to the bathroom. And at that point, the air in New York City was really bad. And people would use the cover of night to burn their garbage. So at night, you know, all these smokestacks were belching this dirty black smoke into the air. And I remember standing over John's crib and crying, because I thought he's breathing in this filth. This little innocent baby with little innocent pink lungs is breathing in this filth. And of my 3 sons, he's the only one with asthma. And I wanted to move out of the city. But Dad said, if you don't love New York, you don't love life. If you don't love New York, you don't love life. So I felt guilty not loving life, so we stayed in New York. And then Roland was born, and both boys went to Trinity School when they were. They went to a little nursery school in the YMCA on West 63rd, between 63rd and West 64th Street, where I'm still a member. And they went to that nursery school, and then they were both enrolled at Trinity School, and loved it. And they wore their little uniforms, and I think each of them got mugged at one point coming home from school. They got mugged for their bus money. And we just had a rather happy life. And Dad had interesting clients and some interesting trips. And I think with John, I don't think I had any domestic help. I think I had a cleaning lady. I think with Roland, I think that's when we had Giulietta, an Italian girl. We gave her we had a little room down the hall, which was like a valet's room or a maid's room with a bathroom, and we gave that to Giulietta, an Italian girl who was studying ballet, and she gave us 3 hours a day, I think, babysitting help. Then later on with Andy, I had full-time, some kind of lady from Poland who helped out.
Memories of giving birth to each of us.
By then, let me think. Yes, so we were still in that tiny apartment on the 3rd floor when John, can I say you? Because since you're talking to me, yeah? When you were born. We still had that little apartment. Oh, even when I had Roland. We didn't move into our big apartment until Roland was 8 months old. Yeah, we moved into the 5th floor, again, double height ceiling. Huge, the ceiling was, I think, the windows were 14 feet tall, the ceiling was 20 feet tall. And we joined 2 apartments. That was quite a job because they were both in very bad shape. And the little one, 516, was in terrible shape. Somebody had ripped out everything, all the pipes, all the radiators, everything was ripped out, and then they just left it. It looked like Warsaw after the Second World War. Rubble everywhere. It was terrible. So we had workmen, and I was the general contractor. So we had a Greek carpenter, we had Israeli plumbers, we had Scottish electricians, we had a Cuban tiler. I had to translate the instructions on the tiling, on the grout, because he couldn't read it in English. I had to translate it for him. So that was a big job. So I was the general contractor for that job. So we ended up with 515 and 516 at 1 West 67th Street, joined together. And it was a fantastic apartment. And we bought a jungle gym for the boys. And what should have been the dining room became this playroom for the boys with this jungle gym. And later on, we built a platform there for John to sleep on. I think the jungle gym remained down below. And I had a lovely modern kitchen. Everything was very picturesque. We had the Café des Artistes downstairs, the restaurant. And occasionally I'd travel in the elevator with somebody carrying a chocolate mousse. And who is it for? It was for the widow of Howard Chandler Christie, the famous artist who painted the famous nudes in the Café des Artistes, the lovely nudes around the walls. And he died, and his contract specified that this was during the Depression, so he wasn't paid in money, he was paid in food for the rest of his life and for the rest of his wife's life. So I used to travel with her food sometimes, although there was a back elevator, but sometimes there I'd be with the chocolate mousse going up to Mrs. Howard Chandler Christie. Another person who lived in our building, there were some famous people, I think Charlie Chaplin maybe lived there at one point. And this authoress, Fanny Hurst, she was quite famous in the 40s, 50s, I think even 60s, Fanny Hurst. She used to travel in the elevator with a teeny little Yorkshire Terrier in her bag. And she had a huge apartment. She had a triplex apartment, enormous apartment, Fanny Hurst. So it was a fun building to live in. And just about every year I'd go to England with my children to visit my parents who were living in London, although Dad was still, at that point, but at that point he'd retired. He'd been working in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, from the 1950s, 1952, I think, to about 65, 1951 maybe to 65. And soon after that, the emperor was deposed and killed. And the royal family was, persecuted, and many of them left. And the country became sort of very socialist, nearly communist.